I see that we have reached the time to begin. I want to welcome all of you here. Glad to see all of you. It's been a while. And also we welcome those that are watching online. I'm sure Jonathan has a number somewhere that says how many there are. But we have good attendance this morning. It's nice to be getting back to I hate to use the word normal because I'm not quite sure what that is, but anyway, we'll be still looking at chapter 7 in the book of Ecclesiastes, some of the things that were not mentioned last week. I believe we got down at about to the middle of the chapter, but one of the problems is that because of time concerns, we have to break these chapters up into little bite-sized pieces, and they were written as a full meal, if we can use that term. In just a moment, Roger's going to lead us in prayer, and then we'll begin our class. Roger.
Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we thank Thee that You've given us this beautiful day in which to live. We thank Thee for the ability to assemble here in this building out of the weather. We'd ask Thee to be with us today and be with our teachers, that they might teach what they've studied and that the audience might learn from what they've studied. We thank Thee that restrictions are less for the virus now. Things are getting somewhat normal. We'd ask Thee to be with us, that we are attentive in class. In Christ's name, amen.
Solomon talked a lot about vanity, and I was doing something vain the other day. I was watching a car chase on on the computer, but as I was watching that, the man who was trying to escape from the police, he kept using various tricks to try to get away, and He even caused an accident, and that caused the police cars that were behind him to be blocked, and they couldn't follow him. And then various other things happened. Finally, he got in a residential area, and he jumped out of his car, and he went over the wall into somebody's yard, crossed the yard, went to another yard and another, over 2 or 3 walls. And finally, he went over the wall of the house facing the other street and ran through that yard and came out at the front, and there was a policeman standing there. And I thought, when I saw that, I thought about what we read back in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 2, where it says, God is in heaven, but you are on the earth, the reminder there. And I thought that's interesting, because this man thought, in all of the maneuvers that he went through, somehow I'm going to escape. And what he didn't know was that there was a helicopter up above him from the police that was telling somebody down below everything that he was doing to try to escape. And in a sense, that's the position we're in with God. He is in heaven. He's looking down on all of this. He sees the relationship of things as they happen. He sees what's going on. He sees what each of us are doing. And in a situation like that, the one who's up above is in a position to tell us what we ought to do. And I thought of that as that's just an old man thought. But nevertheless, God is in a position to direct us. The one who created us, he's able to look down on all that's going on down here. And we may be doing vain things, things that are waste of time in reality, but we think they're important. And yet, if we follow his direction, he is able and he is willing to give us the direction and the guidance that we need. Going back to Solomon, back in 1 Kings chapter 3, we have the origin of Solomon's work as far as we know it, the origin of his reign as a king. And at that time, Solomon, down in chapter 3 and verses 7 and 8, he said, "Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David. But I am a little child." I believe, if I remember correctly, Solomon was 17 at that point. He said, "I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil." I believe either Jonathan or Bob, in their lesson last week, talked about the idea of discerning. And here Solomon makes it very clear what the discerning is all about. Discerning between good and evil. And you know, that's something that we deal with every day of our life. We make decisions. We get to talking about computer stuff sometimes. Actually, I hate mine, but I have to live with it because you can't hardly do without one anymore. But you know what a computer does? It makes a whole lot of little yes-no decisions. When you push a few buttons, then it goes to work and it says yes, no, yes, no, yes, no 100,000 times in just a few seconds, and finally comes up with a conclusion. But the conclusion it comes up with is only what was already there in the first place. Well, we spend our lives making a lot of yes-no decisions as long as we live. And I was thinking the other day, talking about wisdom, sometimes people think that being aged is equal to wisdom. It's not. You gain a lot of experience, but I'm old enough to say that you don't gain wisdom just because you're old. But I realize that every day with the dumb things that I do, and then wondering why I did them. But be that as it may, Solomon talks about the vain things that are going on down here on this earth, things that man is doing or trying to do, and yet God is up above looking down on this. He's seeing all these things we're doing, scurrying around. Did you ever stir up an anthill and then look at it and see the ants? Did you know ants are blind? They are, but that doesn't stop them from moving. And they're rushing about every which direction. If one of them happens to discover you, he may take a bite out of you after you've stirred him up. But in all of that rushing around, and eventually they'll settle down, and then they'll repair their nest, and they'll go back to doing whatever they were doing before. But how like man that is. If we look at our world, we spend a lot of time scurrying around worrying over things, blindly poking here and there, looking for answers. And yet, all the time, the one who's looking down upon us has those answers. All right, Ecclesiastes Chapter 7, and I want to begin down in the middle of the chapter. In fact, I think 16 is where I decided to excuse me, where I decided to begin. I'm not exactly sure where Bob stopped last week. But anyway, Solomon wrote, beginning in verse 16, "Do not be overly righteous, nor overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other. For he who fears God will escape them all." Remember that conclusion there. He who fears God will escape them all. Okay, let's go on a little bit further. "Wisdom strengthens the wise, more than 10 rulers of the city. For there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. Also, do not take to heart everything people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. For many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. All this I have proved by wisdom. I said I will be wise, but it was far from me. As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it out? I applied my heart to know, to search, and seek out wisdom, and the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. And I find more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. Here is what I have found," says the preacher, "adding one thing to the other to find out the reason, which my soul still seeks out, but I cannot find. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. Truly, this only I have found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." Okay, now, there's some things in there that I'm going to leave to Bob to explain next week, because he's still going to be looking at some things in this chapter. But if you notice there were 3 statements that I think we can zero in on today. One is at the end of verse 18. It says, "He who fears God will escape them all." Verse 26, "He who pleases God shall escape from her." And finally, down in verse 29, "Truly this only I have found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." Okay, let's think about those for just a moment. These 3 statements, they're certainly not all that is in chapter 7. And as Roger and I were discussing up here on the front bench, there's more than one lesson to be gained from Ecclesiastes chapter 7. That's true of most of God's word. If we keep studying it, we find that there is more and more and more, and we never completely exhaust it. No matter, after 84 years, I'm still finding things that I didn't see before. And that's just a fact of life. But anyway, in 18, the latter part of that verse, he says, "He who fears God will escape them all." The word fear we've discussed a number of times in this setting. Various ones have talked about it in the classes that are taught here. And when we talk about fearing God, I think probably we're going back to whatever the people in the 16th century understood fear to mean. The word in Greek is some variation of phobos, which is a fear, but maybe respect or reverence would be a better rendition of the actual meaning there. God doesn't expect us to be afraid of him in that we timidly creep around hoping that we're not going to offend him. You know, that's what we find in pagan religions. They're afraid of their gods. They look at God as somebody who has to be appeased all the time. Otherwise, he's going to strike us down. He's going to wipe us out if we don't keep him happy. But I think this is more a matter of respecting God. So those who respect God, they're going to escape these things that are such a problem for mankind, to escape the temptation of sin, to escape the distractions that the world puts before us. If we are respecting God, then we will understand that he's the one who knows what is good for us. He's the one who knows how to direct us, to guide us. So in Proverbs chapter 9 and verse 10, there's a statement there that says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." In Psalm 111 and verse 10, that statement is repeated, but the writer adds something to it. He says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. A good understanding have all those who do his commandments. His praise endures forever." A good understanding is those who do what God tells them to do, keeps his commandments. That's a thought that we need to keep in mind, something that we, along with the idea that God is up there and he sees what's going on down here. You know, I know what's happening up here, or I think I do, up here at the podium. But I don't know everything that's going on out there, and I certainly don't know what's going on outside the walls, but God does. You see, he's able to add all this together, and to him it all is a clear picture. To me, I'm limited by what my senses are able to provide me, and I have the great blessing of being able to look to God's word for those things that I can't see and that I can't figure out for myself. All right. Now, when we talk about wisdom, there's a certain wisdom, or at least we call it wisdom, to be gained by experience. I think that's why one of the qualifications of elders is age. The word presbyteros, which is translated as elder, just means an old man. And if you wait long enough, you get there. But in order to be wise, we need something more. You know, experience teaches us to avoid things that bring bad consequences. Even as a child, we begin to learn that. There was a limb off of an apple tree that I learned a great deal from in my childhood. But I don't know that I learned wisdom, but I certainly learned that there were some things I was not supposed to do. You see, on the way home from school one day, the Johnson family lived about a mile down the road, and I walked home with the kids from the Johnson family, and I don't remember the kids' names even anymore, but one of them said, "Why don't you come in for just a few minutes?" And I forget what the attraction was at that time, but anyway, I went in, and we got to playing, and next thing I knew, it was after 6 o'clock. And I was supposed to be home a couple hours before. Well, when I got home, skipping along, my dad was waiting there with that apple tree limb. And that was the last time I got home late. But so we do learn a little bit from experience. We add to our knowledge, but that's not necessarily going to translate into wisdom. Pain, loss, disappointment, they're hard teachers. They do teach us, but they're hard teachers. But God is willing to offer us wisdom. He's willing to give us the guidance we need to help us with things that we may not be able to figure out by ourselves. All right, so we can gain some wisdom by our own experience. We gain some if we're observant, and if we're humble. We gain by observing others who have wins and failures. We learn something from that, but the bottom line is, these are wisdoms under the sun. This is the kind of wisdom that Solomon was talking about in his day. What happens under the sun. But we need the wisdom that's from above. We need the wisdom that God has to offer us. And God's wisdom, fortunately, is available for the asking. I'm sure all of you have at one time or another read the first chapter of James, where James writes verses 5 through 8. He says, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him." When I read those words, he gives it without reproach, and he gives liberally of wisdom. Have you ever had the experience of asking somebody a question that was very important to you, and the person comes back to you like he thinks you're an absolute dummy for asking the question? Couldn't you figure that out by yourself? Don't you know anything? But you see, God doesn't do that way. It says without reproach. He's not going to make fun of you. He's not going to treat you like a fool because you ask the question or because you ask his help. All right, going on, it says, "But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord, for he is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." I think I'm going to get me a box to stand on next time because everything I try to read falls right on this line of my glasses, and so if I read the same line twice, you'll know why. But anyway, God is willing to help us in terms of wisdom, especially things that have to do with our spiritual life. And a great deal of wisdom is to be gained by reading his word. But we also have the avenue of prayer, where we can ask for what we need, ask for what we feel that we are lacking. So, but one of the things that we need to keep in mind, and I think Solomon is a good example of this. You know, we read what God promised to Solomon. And we read what Solomon's question was or what Solomon's request was to God, that God give him an understanding heart to discern between good and evil, to rule the people in a proper manner. But even wisdom gained is only of value if it's applied. What we learn from God's word and what we gain as a result of asking God for help is only going to benefit us if we put it into practice. It becomes a major responsibility. When we ask God for wisdom, we're responsible for what we get. When we read His Word, we're responsible for what we learn there. And if we apply it, then as Solomon says here, we will escape. Those who fear the Lord, those who respect the Lord, those who trust in what God says will escape so many of the world's temptations, so many of the world's difficulties. I often think of what God told the people as He was leading them out of Egypt. He gave them instructions that we only understood in this century as pertaining to disease prevention, as pertaining to keeping their camp clean. The idea, well, we've had COVID. We understand now, we've learned something by experience about isolation, about quarantine. Even the mask we wear, there's no command in the Bible like that, and yet we understand that it has a purpose, and that purpose is disease prevention. Well, God told Israel when He led them out of Egypt that He would help them to escape the diseases and the plagues of Egypt. And I don't know, you may have read at some time a little book called None of These Diseases. I came across it when we were in Germany. It's called Vermeidbare Krankheiten there, avoidable diseases or illnesses. But in that book, Mr. Macmillan wrote about things that are being done which are harmful to us. And yet many times we have looked at them as a solution to a problem. One of the things that I remember, and it's not a very pleasant thing to talk about, but when you had an open wound, a cut or a wound of some kind that was open, the Egyptians would make a poultice of mule dung and put it on that wound, and that was supposed to bring healing. Well, the dung from the mules or from horses is loaded with tetanus. So many Egyptians died of lockjaw from what was supposed to be a cure. And we can find other things if you look at the Egyptians and their mythology and they wrote a lot, and they explained a lot of things according to their way of thinking. And yet these things were very harmful to the people who practiced them. God knew better. When He brought Israel out of Egypt, He protected them from those things. He taught them sanitation. He taught them what to do with those who were sick. We could get on a tangent here and not get done with what we're supposed to be doing this morning. But anyway, wisdom only has value if it's applied. And it becomes a responsibility if we have it. And certainly there is no Christian who has not gained a certain degree of wisdom, or he would not have become a Christian in the first place. You see, if you remember over in the first chapter of Isaiah, at one point God says, "Come now, let us reason together." What God gives us is reasonable. It's effective. It works. All right, let's move on a little bit further. Down in verse 26, at the end of that verse, "He who pleases God shall escape from her." Now, I'm not going to go into all of the things that it says about women here, but I think this is merely an example of temptations. And by pleasing God, we escape many of the temptations of this world. He who pleases God shall escape. Jesus, in the parable about the demon being cast out of this individual, remember it says that the demon was cast out and he went about looking for a place to land. And eventually he came back to the individual where he had been in the first place. And he says he found the house swept and clean. And he moved back in with 7 of his friends. Well, in this parable, we see what happens to the person who thinks that by throwing out one sin, he can solve the problem. The person who thinks that, oh good, I overcame a temptation today, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. It's all over with. That's done. It's not done. It keeps coming back. And if Satan can't get at you one way, he'll find another way. It's like those blind ants. You know, they find things. But the way they do it is they keep trying and trying. There's been several of them on my kitchen counter lately. I don't know where they're coming in. I wish I did. But they're big black ants, and they come up and they blunder around. I see them run into things, and then they back up and they go around and they keep going until they finally find something that's interesting to them. Maybe it's a grain of sugar, and they'll pick it up and away they go. And the next thing you know, here's a whole string of them coming, following the same track. And according to those who know such things, the ants leave a trail of scent wherever they go, so that the next one that comes along can follow it. Well, now I forgot what I was going to... That'll happen to you too when you get old. Anyway, those who please God, they shall escape many things that are a problem in this world. Many things that become a problem under the sun. In Psalms chapter 9, verses 15 and 16, the psalmist writes there, "And the nations have sunk down in the pit which they have made. In the net which they hid, their own foot is caught. But the Lord is known by the judgment he executes. The wicked is snared in the work of his own hands." And sometimes in trying to use the wisdom, a worldly wisdom, we find ourselves trapped in something we can't escape. But God has wisdom for us. God has help. He has guidance for us that will help us to avoid those things that become an inextricable trap. Proverbs 28, 10, whoever causes the upright to go astray in an evil way, he himself will fall into his own pit, but the blameless will inherit good. And that makes me think of what we see over in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, where the Apostle Paul is writing to the church at Rome. He says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Now, we see two descriptive words there, talking about this sacrifice that we present, not prevent. But the first is holy. Separated for a purpose. The person who is set aside, he has designated his life to serving God. Do you realize that when we become Christians, we have entered into a contract? We have signed our name to a contract with God. A long time ago, through Christ, salvation became available. A long time ago, Christ gave us the example of the life that should be lived. When he was praying in John chapter 17, he said that he had glorified God. How did he do it? He said, I have done everything that you sent me to do. There in chapter 17, he says that. I've done everything that you sent me to do. Part of our responsibility is glorifying God. And the way to do that is to do what God tells us to. You know, we don't realize if it's an individual, if somebody, maybe a teacher in a class comes to the student and gives some good advice, and then the student goes out and does the exact opposite, how does the teacher feel? Probably feels let down, feels that you don't consider his or her instruction of much value, that you don't think their opinion is worth anything, or their guidance is worth the effort to follow it. Don't you think that God also has that type of feeling? When he gives us good advice, when he guides us in a way that protects us, helps us to escape the things that this world would bring upon us and cause us to fail. Don't you think that hurts God? This verse that we just read in Romans chapter 12, that our sacrifice, our living sacrifice, is to be holy. Our life is to be a life set aside to serving God. But also, he says there that it's to be acceptable. And I don't know what acceptable meant in 1611 when the Bible was translated into English. But I do know that the word that the Apostle Paul used there, the word euareston, the you part of it means good. The areston is to be pleasing, well-pleasing. This is what Paul's talking about here. What we present to God should be well-pleasing to him. If we go back to that statement that we found in Ecclesiastes Chapter 5 and verse 2, that God is in heaven and we are on the ground, then we can understand the distance that's between us and God. We can understand the difference between where he is with his endless wisdom and his incomprehensible knowledge. Everything that we discover day by day in this world, God already knew it. Everything that we think is such a great discovery, God knew it a long time ago. And he put the solution here. You know, when we find a medicine that cures a certain illness, that medicine didn't just come into being today. It's been there all the time. We had to find it. God knew about it. All right, I'm going to have to hurry up because I got 3 minutes and 57 seconds. All right. Having pleasing God as our goal will draw one away from sin's attractions. You know, if in the back of your mind, every time you have to make one of these yes-no decisions, the thought is there that I want to please God. I want to do what he would have me do. That puts these attractions or distractions at a distance. It helps us to escape them. Being busy serving God helps us to keep our focus, helps us to simply not have time to do all the things that Satan would present to us. So what keeps us from pleasing God? What keeps us from respecting him? Well, I think there in verse 29, at the end of the chapter, we have the answer. He says, truly only I have found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. Why is it that we have 2,000 different organizations in this world, all calling themselves Christian churches? It's not because God did that. It's because man has thought up, as it says here, many schemes. We keep coming up with something new. We keep wanting to try something else. We're always dissatisfied with what we have, and we want something different. Not necessarily better, but something different. And this gets us into trouble. But God made man upright. Remember back in the Old Testament, when God created this universe, verse 4 of Genesis chapter 1, God said, it is good. Verse 10, he said it's good. Verse 12, he said it's good. Verse 18, verse 21, verse 25, all of those times God looked at what he was doing and he said it's good. But then he created man and he looked at all that he had done and he said it is very good. So God made man upright to begin. But man has thought up things, or man has given in to the distractions, given in to the attractions that draw him away from God. Now, with 46 seconds left, I think we better think about stopping. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry if I put you to sleep, but what God has to offer us is a great bargain. There's no place else where we can find the peace and the great rewards that God holds out to us. Thank you.